Thank you to Mediamorfosis and Damien for inviting me. Just to sort of quickly introduce what I do, I'm a writer and producer. I've worked in film and television. Here I am. Here. And I also do something called content strategy, which people in the web area will know. Generally speaking, it's a... Is this very loud? Just gonna. People who know sort of the web world, that's basically working with web design or different types of interactive projects, helping them sort of express their stories that may involve multiple platforms or using these sort of these new digital formats. I got involved in this partly because, like many of you, I was in the film and television business, but then I became very interested. I was always very eager and interested in technology, and soon found myself working in a number of different forms that, online, on interactive, in games. And for me, it began to feel like, if you're in this world, you have to be able to adjust because many of the different formats influence each other. So it really becomes, imperative that we understand, if not work in, at least understand how the different formats work and why and how they bleed into each other, but also how they can sort of maybe come together and tell stories and work together in new and innovative ways. I loved film and cinema. I still do, but I love it when it was experimental and it had energy and it had something that you could innovate. And I find sometimes with older, what we call traditional media, they've sort of stayed the same. They haven't really changed. And I've become very interested in how media does change. I love this wave that Damien keeps talking about. But that wave isn't new. It's been going on for a while. So first of all, let's talk about this word, transmedia. For me, transmedia has gone a little bit wrong. In part because I think there's a lot of confusion about it. What is transmedia? I think if I was to ask every single one of you to define it, you would all say something very, very different. Oh, thank you, water. And in this regard, this is the old, this notion of the elephant, and we all can touch different parts of the elephant. All the different blind men are touching the elephant, and they describe it, but they all describe it quite differently. And I think that's where we are, quite frankly, I'm having problems with this, there we go, in this space, because we're all feeling a different part of the elephant, and everyone's going to claim, as we do in media, because there's ego often involved, that this is what transmedia is. It's this, it's that. I don't really believe in anything like that. I really believe in the whole elephant. So I'm very agnostic in that regard. But it is important to recognize that this is part of the discussion and what's going on. So what is transmedia? Is it a franchise? Is it branded content? Is it a combination of these things? For me, I find it easier to go back to a sort of a more general or a more creative way of describing it, which is to say that this is about experience. All of art is about experience, So I find that when we start talking about this type of work, it's better to use this notion of experience, of generating this type of, so it's still storytelling, but it's the experience around storytelling. It no longer is just about being a viewer, for example. We now have users. We now have interactivity. But again, even when you are making a film or a television program, that is its own kind of experience. When you start to use virtual reality, that's clearly a very different experience, but there may be still ways of kind of combining them or looking at them in the same way. But what we've noticed, and this is true in art, certainly, and in film, is that this experience has evolved. It is now changed, and it has been changing since it began. So Damien used this reference to the Luminaire film that everyone does. I think Liz just said they don't allow it anymore. You can't use this expression anymore because everyone uses it. But everyone uses it because it's a very good way to understand where we've come from. So when you had this experience, this spectacle, which is what film was, it's a little bit like where virtual reality is now. It was sort of fun. It's a spectacle. No one really thought much about story. Just a train coming into a station was enough because it was fun, it was new. But eventually these things get old, and you need to start to evolve that experience. And one of the first examples I always point to, which people sort of maybe forget, is in 1911, Carl Laemmle decided that he would create these magazines that would come out contemporaneously with his films. Now he was Biograph, and he decided to come up with these magazines. Now this is the time of silent film, so the text was very short, so the scenes were kind of very short. You only had a little bit of room to describe them. So what he would do in these magazines, he would add additional dialogue to build out the experience of these scenes. He would also do them, because he was a businessman, he would advertise his next movie, so to make sure you'd come back again. And then he did this other really strange idea. He started to talk about the actors in the movie. Now, at the time, they didn't even have credits. You didn't know who the actors were. They were never identified. And at the time, people thought this was crazy. Who cares about the actors? Well, we now know very clearly that people do care about the actors. They're the movie stars. And in many ways, this notion of a movie star is a transmedial notion. When we see a George Clooney movie, we know George Clooney. I know him very well. I've seen all of his movies. So your impression of who he is when you're going into that movie is already established. So you're taking it from one experience into this new one. That's transmedia. And when we cast a movie in Hollywood, and you are always thinking about what that is. Now, this is something very important, especially as actors, have to start thinking about what this means. But then you have to really start thinking about what's your strategy and how you're approaching that. Now, another example I like to use is sort of the great auteur that we all know, Alfred Hitchcock. There was a movie that came out about this, so some of you may have known this, but basically Hitchcock, he used a very early true form of engagement. He used narrative engagement to capture his audiences. It was very active because there was a very clear role for the audience to be. It was this subjective point of view. And now, one of the things, what was happening in Hitch's career after he had finished, I believe it was North by Northwest, which was considered a huge success. From Hitchcock's point of view, his career was over. He was done. He was old. And he was, dare I say, going to become irrelevant. So he needed to do something shocking, something really that will change everyone, and he did. And this is a very interesting part of that story that no one, I think, really necessarily fully understands. So when Hitchcock had a very clear idea, as an auteur, he had a very clear message that he was always sort of saying, a core understanding. In order to identify with our hero, he focused on three very important feelings, emotions. There is anxiety, there is chaos, and there is guilt. And this is imperative in a Hitchcock movie. Pretty much in all of his movies, it kind of deals with these issues. Because as human beings, we all know these feelings very well. Now, with the film Psycho, it was based on a nonfiction book about a serial killer in Wisconsin named Ed Gein. Now, this story had none of this anxiety, guilt, and chaos built in. So Hitchcock needed to write and create the first third of this story totally out of nowhere. I mean, he obviously changed a lot of the story, but he had to build out this story because it wasn't in the book. And so what he did is he tells the story of Marion Crane. Now, when we first meet Marion Crane, we know she's guilty and she's a bad woman because she's having sex. Okay? And we peek in at her through her window, and she's naked or partially naked, as naked as you could get in the 60s. Not only is she having sex, she's having sex with a married man in the afternoon. So clearly this woman is guilty and is very bad. And she's having an affair. This guy wants to leave his wife, but he can't afford it. He needs money. So Marion goes to work, and right when she gets in, a really rich guy shows up who's throwing around his money. And I don't know about you, but when people start throwing around wads of money, it makes me a little anxious. I get a little nervous. And so here's this guy throwing around the money, and Marion's like, God, I really could use a lot of money. And next thing you know, she's going to take the money to the bank, and it's Friday afternoon, and I'll see you on Monday. Well, Marion decides she's going to take the money, get in her car, and drive to see her boyfriend, give him the money so he can divorce the wife, and then they can live and sin together because they're guilty. And I don't know about you, I'm already feeling anxious, and she's anxious. You can tell she's driving out of town, and of course, she said she was going home sick. She goes and runs into her boss, who's walking across the street, and is like, what are you doing out? So clearly, she's now about to get caught. Her guilt, her anxiety is increasing. She gets on the road. What happens? She gets tired, she falls asleep, she wakes up, and this part of the movie actually is almost like 15 minutes. It's almost 1/6 of the movie is just her driving. What happens? A police officer picks her up with the dark glasses, staring at you. Because you know what? Whenever you see a police officer, we're all guilty, right? We've all done something wrong. And she's beginning to get anxious, and what comes with anxiety is this chaotic feeling. She can't get anything, she can't remember what she's doing, she's bumbling, she doesn't know what to do. The police officer is really suspicious of her. She has to go and try to sell her car, so she's going to buy a new car, and she can't even, get the luggage right, and she's, I'll take anything, I'll take that car. The salesman's like, why are you so pushy? It's so unusual. She gets in the car, she heads off, she keeps driving, and what happens? It starts to rain. So chaos. I mean, this is like in Argentina now, right? So it's chaos, and the rain is coming, and she's anxious. She's bad. And luckily, and then she gets off the main road. She can't even find her way. So good thing there's a hotel along the side of the road, so she pulls in there. She's going to go to sleep, get a little rest. And then Marion decides, thank God, she's going to go back home. She's going to return the money. She's met this nice man, Norman. She's had a sandwich with him, and she realizes sitting there that she can't live this life of guilt and anxiety and chaos anymore. She's going to go home. She's going to return the money. She's going to live a good, respectable life. And so what we've now created is all this suspense and tension with a moment of relief because she's going to return to normality, to end the chaos. And I don't know about you, but when I'm really anxious and uptight, I often like to have a shower. The sound, I think, isn't on. But, yeah? There it is, a little louder. But now I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to show you any more because Hitchcock would be rolling in his grave if I showed you anything. Now, what I've just taken you through is the first 30 minutes of Psycho. And it's absolutely imperative that you understand and experience this first 30 minutes of Psycho. If you do not experience this first 30 minutes of Psycho, you will not get Psycho. It will not work. It will be ruined. It will be a terrible film. Now, let's go to how people watched movies in 1960. They tended to show up halfway through the movie. They'd walk in, they'd buy a ticket, walk in, watch the movie, and then watch it from the beginning to where they came in. That ain't gonna work for Hitchcock. So he has to do something. Now, this is in part to do with the fact that people were watching a lot of television. Quite frankly, part of Hitchcock's problem was that he had a very successful TV show. So people just got used to Hitchcock. There was nothing sort of special about it. He had to do something that made it an event, and he had to have a really important reason for people to come to a theater, but he also had to have a certain way in which you experience this film. If you don't have that, it's not going to work, which means he has to change user behavior. He has to understand and then deal with this issue. And so, Hitchcock does this.
This is Alfred Hitchcock. Having lived with Psycho since it was a gleam in my camera's eye, I now exercise my parental rights in revealing a number of significant facts about this slightly extraordinary entertainment.
This is a press book on film, an advanced press book to present to you a visual story on the care and handling of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The scene is the DeMille Theater in New York. The entire motion picture industry knows that Psycho is being exhibited with a special presentation policy, a creation of Paramount Pictures showmanship. The man in the tuxedo is Nick Justin of the DeMille Theater. He is a theater manager. He is the main instrument of the policy. Listen now to the heart of the policy.
I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
And here is what Broadway saw. No one, but no one, will be admitted to the theater after the start of each performance of Psycho. The audience had been sold this concept. With it, they were sold on Psycho. Mr. Hitchcock tells you, as he told them, why.
This, of course, is to help you enjoy Psycho more. We really have only your enjoyment in mind.
The campaign began with newspaper teaser ads calling attention to explaining, selling the policy. The keep the story a secret idea supplemented the policy. Special Hitchcock ads, well in advance, announced why it was desirable to see Psycho from the beginning. Close to opening day, another Hitchcock ad told why it was required, and clearly supplied the audience with the time schedule of Psycho performances, as did every display ad before Psycho opened. The directory ads, after opening, confirmed the Psycho policy, gave the show times clearly. When they came to the theater, the audience saw Hitchcock in person. Well, not really. But with him there was a real live Pinkerton policeman to emphasize the policy story which the newspaper ads had pre-sold. We won't allow you to cheat yourself. You must see Psycho from the beginning to end to enjoy it fully. Therefore, do not expect to be admitted into the theater after the start of each performance of the picture. We say no one, and we mean no one. Not even the manager's brother, the President of the United States, or the Queen of England. God bless her.
So there's a lot of things going on right here, which I'd like to sort of then review. Hitchcock now has to just do something which people could just say is kind of like showmanship or a gimmick, but he has to actually do more than just do something to get people to come to the theater. He has to change his behavior, but he's also doing something else. Because remember what I described in that first 30 minutes about anxiety and chaos and guilt? He decided that not only will he get people to the theater at the beginning and change their behavior, he's going to get them to start to feel these things before they enter the theater. Because what he's going to do is he's going to do these things where he's going to, even when the film was being made, he made the cast and crew take an oath. You cannot tell, and you heard in this, you couldn't tell the ending. If you did, you're guilty. So all of a sudden, the onus is on you. You have some responsibility. Or you had a Pinkerton police officer. So why was the cop there? Because chaos could happen at any second. There was panic. There was a chance of total chaos at the outbreak of these movies. You had all these rules, again, that you had to follow. You had all of these kinds of requirements. Now, what happens when you have to wait for a movie? You form a line. Now, what happens when you stand in a line? You get anxious. You get kind of uncomfortable. And not just that. Now, remember, people hadn't been standing in lines for movies in a very long time. So what started to happen was that these lines would go down the block, and then they'd have to skip into the next block. So it was a blockbuster. Psycho was the first blockbuster. And then finally, he has himself in the center of it. Remember how Hitchcock always made an appearance in his movies? This is where he made his appearance, but he made it in the theater itself. So all of these things are going to one point, which is he has to get people to start to experience this in a very particular way, but he's not going to do it just, here, I'm Hitchcock, do it this way. I'm going to make you feel what you need to feel. I'm going to prepare you for this experience. And as a result, the film was a massive success. And I think when I look to this is a critical sort of example because it shows that the great auteur, Hitchcock, was also thinking this way. He didn't have a smartphone, but he had newspapers. He had movie trailers. He had all these other ways of sort of engaging the audience. And again, that's what he understood about filmmaking. And this is, I guess, sort of a premise of my argument, is that many of these approaches that we're thinking about today are really not new. What's new is the technology and the ways in which we can sort of reach and connect and engage the audience. But our job as content creators, as filmmakers, as storytellers, is to engage. This notion, I think, goes back to sort of art itself. I think it's always imperative that art engages, or if it doesn't engage, then that's what you're trying to do, to not engage, but at least you're thinking about what that experience around engagement is. It's always guided by user behavior, whether we like it or not. I think we are now in a time where the audiences have moved ahead of where the the producers and the content creators are. And so we're needing to start to catch up to understanding that user behavior. And we also need to understand the sort of notion of levels of engagement, how engagement can operate in different ways. For example, there's a level of engagement when you're playing a video game or in a VR movie because you're really immersed, you're really involved. And then there's a level of engagement of watching a television program or a movie. Those are different levels of engagement. We often talk about this as hot and cold media. When we start to think of the notion of engagement, I think about it at least in terms of these kind of three levels. There's the passive, which is traditional, and often I'll say something like even traditional marketing often relies on that. They'll have movie trailers or movie posters, but the engagement is more in the story, or what they call narrative engagement, or it's in the way it markets a movie. Then there's this sort of casual engagement, which is more of this sort of minor commitment. This is what we're seeing a lot of today. This is the very kind of like the apps, the games, sort of this kind of swag, as we call it in marketing, where people sort of go and kind of, oh, I'm thinking about this movie because I'm playing a web video game or something like that. This kind of engagement is interesting and people are playing with it, but it is lacking something. It doesn't have that sort of meaning or value necessarily. And then there's this active engagement. And this is something I think is the most interesting space, although when it becomes very active, or shall I say, when it requires the audience to become very active, you have a lower number of participants. So it's really important to understand why you're making it active, how you're making it active. For me, the most effective way to make an active kind of engagement is to make sure that what you're creating for that engagement has real value and meaning to the audience. Often, look, making a film, a television program is hard enough. when you have to start thinking about all these other things, it's an impossible task. So it is challenging. But the question is that we particularly in Hollywood, they spend a lot of money on marketing. I can't even begin to tell you how many millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, they just spend in just making the movie trailer, the most passive form of engagement. When they start to do these other pieces, it seems like an impossible task to make it active. The real answer always comes down to how much are the creators of the project involved? How much value does the audience see in that engagement? Because if they see value in it, it becomes suddenly more active. So let's look inside a little bit. I talk about this type of process, or my process in creating this content, very much in terms of the aesthetic as well, and then there's the integration of how all these components come together. So when I talk about the aesthetic, I use this as my guide. This is from Aristotle Poetics, in the language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action and not narrative. And this, of course, is Aristotle. And what Aristotle said is that there were these 6 parts to the play. And these are still parts of the aesthetic, right? We still need these: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and melody. These are all parts of it. Now, in this world of multiple platforms, we've added to the list. One of the first things to look at is this notion of fragmentation. This is a really complex idea, and we have a limited amount of time. So let me just explain that it's fragmentation. I think it adds levels of complexity to the project. I feel like this is very much of an influence of video games. Video games very much use fragmentation as part of the game mechanic, as a way to get people sort of engaged and sort of looking for this piece or that piece. It actually, what's nice about that is that the more that the piece is fragmented that you have to discover and piece together, creates a greater sense of immersion. And finally, the concern, though, and this is always an issue with when you're trying to sort of do something like, let's say, a game that also is a film, is that this level can overcomplicate the experience. You don't know, let's say if you create lots of fragments, how do you know your audience found everything? It adds to that level. So your strategy and your design is imperative is important to make sure that that happens, or if it doesn't happen, people can find their way back. So the path is really critical. Another aesthetic that I think is really important is this notion of generative, user-generated content. Whenever I talk to technology people, the last thing Google wanted to do was make content. They don't want to be directors. They don't want to be filmmakers or storytellers. They want the audience to be the storytellers. And that's what YouTube is. And so why YouTube is so, I mean, can you imagine what would happen if YouTube disappeared tomorrow? Or even Twitter. Twitter's the same way. In fact, Twitter could disappear. It's not making any money. What would we do? But these pieces work, and why they're successful is because they are entirely user-generated content. What you're engaged with is reading and watching and experiencing what other users are creating for you. That creates this sort of dynamic quality in pieces. So if you can find a place in your project to have this sort of user-generated or generative aspect, it creates some dynamic. There's a feeling that people can sort of see things happening and changing. It becomes responsive. One of the things that people didn't understand when it first started happening was when they would be imitated or memed on YouTube. They thought it was a bad thing. Actually, that's a great thing. Because what that means is you now have more content about your original project that you had nothing to do with, but it only gets people laughing or enjoying it in perhaps a different way. Look, one of the things I say about filmmakers is a quote from Francis Ford Coppola. He said, He likes being a filmmaker because it's the last place in the Western world you can be a dictator and get away with it. But what that really means is that filmmakers are kind of control freaks. Producers, often they want to control everything. In this new world, you can't. You have to start to release that control. And the user-generated content does that because it gives the audience authorship. And it allows them to be part of the storytelling experience. What that means is what I talked about earlier, this notion of active engagement, because the audience now feels they're valued in it. Now, nothing explains this better than this notion of the sort of the culture of participation. This is a quote by Henry Jenkins, who is often considered the godfather of transmedia. Of course, he'll define transmedia in his own way, which is about participation. But it's vital that we understand this. Fans are the most active segment of the media audience, ones that refuse to simply accept what they are given, but rather insist on the rights to become full participants. When I first came to Hollywood and I worked on a television series for NBC, it was an alien conspiracy series. And this was in the sort of 96, so in the mid to late 90s. People, within a couple weeks of the show, started putting up websites. This was a time when websites weren't so easy to build. You didn't have all these tools at your disposal. So people had to put in effort. I went into the writer's room and said, look, everyone, we've got fans. And everyone said, Adam, don't talk to those people. Don't engage them. They're crazy. I mean, they are crazy. They're UFO nuts. So they were kind of right, but not engage them seemed like a crazy idea. And luckily, one of the creators of the show, who I've then continued to work with, said, no, let's find a way to engage them. And we did. And I think it was a great lesson for me. And then since that time, I think Hollywood has begun to realize, oh no, we need to engage them. It's very important to engage them. That gives this notion, that gives the feeling of participation. Now, Jenkins defines this participatory culture in these 5 aspects, and I'll read them because it's really important. One is participation must have a low barrier of entry. It can't be so hard that people drop out. You have to understand, who's your audience? Are they super computer savvy? Are they not? How do they understand the technologies and that sort of thing? There should be ample reason and desire to share among the participants. There is this sort of often this component of training or knowledge transfer from someone, a mentor or someone of experience and knowledge. There has to be value. There is this sort of awakening aha moment. Oh my gosh, what I'm doing actually means something. And then finally, this should encourage the social connection between other people, the sort of coming back to the community and then wanting to live it with all these other people. What I find very interesting about these 5 steps is that they're just like Joseph Campbell's notion of the hero, the journey of the hero. The hero is called on the adventure. There is this threshold that they must pass. They get help and often are challenged from a mentor. They have this revelation, a transformational moment that has value to them, and then they return. And this, I believe, is how we need to be thinking about our audiences. It's no longer just our hero in our story that goes on this journey. Our audiences are too. So quickly, I want to talk about story worlds. Often this gets, in the academic circles in particular, it gets overanalyzed to the point that I don't know if it helps. As a writer, I find that I'll create Bibles that are little Bibles, like 20-page Bibles. Longer Bibles with long story worlds might be fun for you, but no one else finds it interesting. So I tend to keep them at a minimum. So story worlds are, in how I think about them, they can be a little bit more complicated than this, but generally speaking, they're broken up into 3 categories. There's the topos, which is the setting, and that's sort of the world around the characters. Often there's a kind of the economic situations that's going on, the sort of historical perspective. There's this, often where is technology in the setting because often you're using technology, and that could be an important, a vital way of engaging the audience. There's the mythos. This is mythology. Now, this is the area that people often get kind of lost in. This obviously goes into the long story behind the character. It gives their perspective and where they come from, their background. And then finally, there's the ethos. I think the ethos is probably the most important component because it really talks about sort of the notion of morality in the character and their worldview, their center of good, as we often say in writing, where you may have a character who is diabolical, evil, but you like him anyway. Walter White is sort of this perfect example. I mean, he actually journeys from a character who's very empathetic, and we care about. Walter White is from Breaking Bad, for people who don't know. We care about him, and then he goes on this journey into this descent into evil, and it is fascinating. So that is the ethos, and understanding that about your character is vital. Now, this is sort of more basic character writing stuff, but I think is absolutely important. All right, so I wanted to sort of get through this. This is sort of the more, detailed breakdown of these things. Archetypes. With mythology, what's very helpful about archetypes is understanding that stories often are similar as they go through history and go through time. It's valuable to understand the shapes of these characters, in a sense, that we've seen before. Again, we talked about actors, movie stars that go from movie to movie. That's a transmedial notion. Archetypes is also, in that way, transmedial. And then, obviously, the ethos. So for the sake of time, I want to move to this notion of integration. Integration really starts with, and this is the part where often, as a content strategist, I work with companies and with projects to help them with. Really one of the most important things is understanding what platform you're using. This is like the first slide I ever made, like 5 years or 6 years ago. And I used to have to expand it, but now it's all really expanded in that far one, the one around community. The important thing to understand about the selection of platform is that certain platforms, and this is what I hinted to about with games, tell a story a certain way. So the way in which you engage on a mobile device and have that experience, I often find that very intimate, is very different than when you go to a theater to watch a movie, which is more public, which is different than the immersive experience of a game. And there's a lot written about this. There's a lot more detail in this. But what's vital to take away is choose your platform wisely. And particular, this last part, the community. Because even within just that one area, there are multiple characteristics of these platforms. So in social media, for example, this is all about a donut. Twitter, I'm eating a donut. Facebook, I like a donut. Foursquare, shows you how old it is. This is where I eat donuts. Instagram, this is a vintage photo of a donut. YouTube, here I'm eating a donut. LinkedIn, my skills about donut eating. Pinterest, of course, is a donut recipe. And then Last.fm, again, now listening to donuts. And then finally, the last one, Google+, I'm a Google employee who likes donuts. Sorry, Google, if anyone's here from Google. The takeaway here is that understand, and when you talk to community managers, we'll play this game of like, who uses what social media and how, and what for. There are demographics attached to each one of these. These speak to very different groups. One thing we're also seeing right now is this notion of context collapse. So essentially, this is sort of the arc of what happens with these social media sites. We're facing this now at Facebook. The reason why Facebook bought Instagram is because all of the younger users of Facebook are not using Facebook anymore. Well, let's face it, would you use Facebook and show all those crazy party photos of yours if your mother was on Facebook? If your grandmother was on Facebook? It's really not where you want to share those moments, right? So that's context collapse. That's where the social media can't hold all the audience. It's getting too big, it's too diverse. And that's something that we're definitely noticing. So again, when choosing a platform and choosing the social media, understand why you're choosing it. Also, culturally, certain countries, certain nationalities use certain social media more than others. And I think the one thing we're seeing right now, which is really, really important, is this notion of social proof. You know, when you deal with like businesses, like if you're creative, you know, you're just like, I want people to see my movie. You know, that's all I care about. When you're a business person, you're like, you have an ROI and you want real verifiable value. Like, what is the value of doing this sort of transmedia stuff? And quite frankly, it is sometimes very hard to monetize. This is a big struggle that we're having in Hollywood because money is being spent. What's the value of it? The value now we're beginning to understand is that fans and followers are this new currency. They start to actually show a value in property, and this very much is like when we talk about brand, which I'll get to in a second, but it's this important, I think, value about when they say for monetization, content is king. When you show a community, you're showing a kind of authenticity. And that has this great value. And the problem, of course, is that the bigger the community and the more promotion you do, you're less authentic. And so it's really that balance of sort of understanding how to maintain that authenticity, how to maintain that truth in the midst of that sort of larger awareness. So branding, I always talk about branding because I think one of the big confusions often about this world is, well, in fact, a lot of times in Hollywood, people have just said, oh, transmedia, that's just marketing. And to a certain degree, they're right. But let's look at what marketing really is. Marketing has always been part of the story. Obviously, this is the TV show Mad Men, but if people watch the TV show Mad Men, you'll see in that show, where did television come from? Television was basically the stuff that was around the commercials. It was invented by advertisers and ad agencies. They invented television. So this notion that marketing is, not part of the story is wrong. And again, it goes back to this question of value. The problem with a lot of marketing is it often is just the trailer or it's swag. It doesn't hold a lot of meaning for the audience, but it is still partly telling the story. So a lot of the tricks that were developed by marketing folks are things that we can learn from and figure out. As I say, we need to find our trans in the projects, and some of the other speakers are going to talk to you about how you do that, how do you expand that world and experience. But this goes to a very important point about the value. Okay? Marketing is about values. Does anyone know who said that? And I think the way to think about him is in terms of how we tell our stories. And here I am, the guy from the US, talking about content is all about advertising or marketing. It's not everything, but it isn't wrong, I think, to think about all of our projects, even independent art house projects that are meaningful and are telling important stories. They're still a brand. And in that brand, Jobs talked about it as being a kind of bank account. There are components that are really good, and that's a deposit. And when you do something in that brand and people like it, that's a deposit. When you do something in that brand and it's awful, that's called a withdrawal. And so my best case for this, and again, I'm showing my geek here, so please excuse me. This was a withdrawal from the brand. Lucas has never heard the end of how awful this character was to introduce, and people were so disappointed. But luckily, a few years later, this came out, and so for the younger fans and for hardcore fans, and now there's a new one, Rebels, this reintroduced the franchise, and now J.J. Abrams is taking it over. Let's hope it all kind of comes together. It's looking good in all the trailers. We're all excited for it. Let's hope this is a deposit and not a withdrawal. So I finally just want to say this. when we talk about this type of material, we talk about this approach to storytelling, this experience approach, you really have to ask yourself, what do you want to do? Because this is what people are doing. This is how you break the internet. And what we need to learn from our Kim Kardashians or all these other sort of versions of reality that are out there is, what is it about them that's creating this type of interest, this mass appeal? And how can we start to take part of that and maybe apply to something that has a little more meaning or a little more value for at least what we're trying to say and what we're trying to do? And with that, I thank you.